Hello everyone. Welcome to The Missing Link. I know you use these videos to unwind and drift off to sleep, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. In our very first episode tonight, we investigate the haunting case of the septic tank killer, a hidden horror that still leaves a huge question mark today. Join us as we unravel the disturbing details of a killer whose twisted crimes have haunted a small community for years. Now get comfortable and relax. The town of Ridgway, Georgia, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Or at least, that's what people like to believe. With a population of just over 3,000, it was small enough that a new face stood out, but large enough for people to disappear without immediate notice. For years, an unsettling pattern had been forming. People vanished without a trace, their disappearances separated by months, sometimes years, leaving behind only unanswered questions. First, it was a drifter, a man no one really knew, last seen near a roadside gas station. Then, a local waitress, young and full of life, who clocked out of her shift one night and was never seen again. As time passed, the missing persons report stacked up. A mechanic, a retired school teacher, a delivery driver, each one vanishing without a clue. But the town's rural isolation and slow-moving authorities meant cases went cold fast. Some believed the victims had just left town, seeking better opportunities, while others whispered rumors about something darker lurking beneath the town's quiet surface. What made the disappearances particularly strange was their lack of connection. The missing people had nothing in common: different ages, genders, and backgrounds, making it impossible to establish a clear motive. Some believed the disappearances were coincidences. Others thought it was bad luck. But no one imagined the truth that lay just beneath their feet. The local sheriff, a man who had held the job for over 2 decades, dismissed the concerns as runaways or accidents, reluctant to stir fear in the community. But when Deputy Marcus Hale, a new officer fresh out of the state academy, was assigned to look into the missing persons cases, he noticed something chilling. Every one of the victims had, at some point, interacted with a local handyman, a quiet, unassuming man named Carl Henshaw, known for fixing pipes, repairing roofs, and working on septic systems. Hale's gut told him something wasn't right, but with no evidence and a town unwilling to believe that one of their own could be a monster, his suspicions remained just that, suspicions. For now, the town slept soundly, unaware that a nightmare had been growing in its backyard for years. It started as a simple service call, nothing out of the ordinary for a town like Ridgway, where old houses and aging infrastructure kept local tradesmen in business. Wayne Calloway, a local plumber known for his meticulous work, had received multiple complaints about a foul stench lingering near the edge of town, close to a property owned by none other than Carl Henshaw. The smell was unbearable, a sickly mix of rot and sewage that clung to the humid air like a curse. Neighbors, those who lived closest to the property, had noticed it getting worse over time, but they assumed it was just another case of a backed-up system or a dead animal rotting beneath the floorboards. Some even joked that Carl was just a filthy old man who didn't take care of his property. But Wayne had been in the plumbing business for 30 years, and he knew the difference between a bad septic system and the stench of death. With his toolkit in hand, he pulled up to Henshaw's property, a run-down single-story house surrounded by waist-high weeds and rusting equipment. The septic tank sat in the backyard, partially hidden by a row of discarded pipes and a half-buried bathtub. Wayne muttered under his breath, already dreading the work ahead. But as he got closer, his stomach turned. The smell was different. It wasn't just sewage. It was something far worse. Gagging, he covered his nose with his sleeve and examined the ground. The soil near the tank was dark and damp, almost like it had been recently disturbed. His boots sank slightly into the mud, and something about it sent an uneasy chill down his spine. Swallowing his discomfort, he pried open the rusted metal lid of the septic tank, expecting to see sludge and waste. What he saw instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. A bloated human hand, its flesh swollen and pale, floated just beneath the surface of the thick, dark liquid. At first, Wayne thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He blinked, staggering backward, his brain struggling to rationalize what he was seeing. But the truth was undeniable. He wasn't looking at sewage. He was looking at decay. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, fumbling to dial 911. The smell seemed to thicken in the air as he waited, the seconds stretching into an eternity. When the dispatcher answered, his voice cracked as he choked out the words. I think there's a body in the septic tank." Within minutes, the sheriff's department arrived, their flashing red and blue lights painting the overgrown yard in shifting colors. Deputies moved in cautiously, their faces turning pale as they caught the first whiff of the scene. The sheriff, who had dismissed the disappearances for years, stood in stunned silence as he peered into the tank. There was no denying it now. Ridgeway had a killer in its midst. The forensic team was called in, and the area was cordoned off as an active crime scene. By the time the sun set, the once quiet property was swarming with investigators, crime scene analysts, and journalists who had caught wind of the gruesome discovery. As authorities worked through the night, they drained the septic tank, and what they found inside would shock the entire town. Not just one body, but fragments of several. Pieces of human bone, rotting flesh, and tattered clothing surfaced from the murky depths, confirming what no one had wanted to believe. This was no accident. This was a dumping ground. Carl Henshaw had nowhere to hide. His quiet, unassuming life had just been ripped open, like the rusted lid of his septic tank, and the entire town was about to learn the monstrous truth that had been festering beneath their feet for years. The news of the septic tank discovery spread through Ridgeway like wildfire, igniting a storm of fear, speculation, and disbelief. People who had once waved at Carl Henshaw in passing now whispered his name in hushed, horrified tones. How had a man who lived among them for over 2 decades managed to hide such unimaginable darkness? How had he attended church gatherings, shopped at the local grocery store, and fixed their broken pipes while secretly disposing of human remains in his own backyard? The more the town thought about it, the more disturbing it became. Carl Henshaw was an unremarkable man by all appearances. He was in his late 50s, his face weathered from years of outdoor labor, his hands rough and calloused from fixing things that others had broken. He never married, never had children, and never seemed particularly close to anyone. He kept his head down and worked odd jobs, fixing roofs, clearing out septic tanks, and repairing plumbing. To most people, he was just another handyman, the kind of man you called when something went wrong. He lived in a modest home on the outskirts of town, a place so cluttered with scrap metal and broken tools that people rarely ventured past the front yard. Yet behind those rusting gates and overgrown weeds, a nightmare had unfolded, one that had gone unnoticed for years. As investigators dug deeper into Carl's past, they began to connect the dots between him and the missing persons cases that had plagued Ridgeway for nearly 2 decades. Records showed that every victim had either hired Carl for repairs or had some minor interaction with him before they vanished. A few had called him for plumbing work. Others had seen him at local job sites. Some had merely crossed his path by chance. It was a pattern that had gone undetected until now. The more the police searched his property, the darker the discoveries became. Inside his house, they found a workshop of horrors. There were boxes filled with random personal items, watches, wallets, shoes, belonging to people who were no longer alive. A hidden crawl space beneath his home contained tattered clothing, some still stained with dried blood. But the most disturbing discovery was found in his basement, a collection of videotapes labeled with dates that matched the disappearances. Investigators watched in stunned horror as they realized what the tapes contained, recordings of his victims. Some showed them pleading for their lives. Others captured the eerie normalcy of Carl's interactions with them before their final moments. He had filmed them in his home, sometimes offering them food, sometimes calmly chatting before the inevitable. As more details emerged, the town's shock turned into dread. Carl wasn't just a killer, he was a hunter. He had used his occupation as a handyman to move unnoticed, a ghost who could slip into people's homes under the guise of fixing a leak or repairing a drain. No one had ever suspected him, because he was always there, a fixture of the community, the quiet man who never made trouble. Even more chilling was the realization that Carl had likely been in the homes of nearly everyone in town at some point. Had they been close to becoming victims themselves? Had they unknowingly let a monster into their homes? The sheer thought sent shivers down their spines. As authorities built their case, Carl Henshaw refused to speak. He remained calm and silent as they led him away, his expression unreadable. The man who had spent years hiding in plain sight had finally been exposed, but the true depths of his evil had yet to be fully uncovered. As authorities dug deeper, both figuratively and literally, the full scale of Carl Henshaw's horrors began to unfold. The septic tank had been only the beginning, a gruesome gateway into a nightmare far worse than anyone in Ridgeway could have imagined. Investigators drained the entire system, a slow, stomach-turning process that unearthed years of horror buried beneath the surface. What they recovered was not just human remains, but a timeline of death, a layered history of victims, their bones and tissue interwoven with the sludge. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, cataloging every bone fragment, every piece of clothing, every piece of evidence that could help identify the faceless victims. The problem was that many of the remains had been liquefied over time. Their DNA dissolved into the filth, making identification nearly impossible. Some remains were older than others, showing that Carl's killing spree had lasted far longer than anyone had initially believed. Some forensic experts estimated that the earliest remains could date back 20 years, meaning that Carl had been killing long before the town even suspected anything. Beyond the septic tank, authorities expanded their search to the rest of Carl's property, and what they found was even more disturbing. In his shed, they discovered rusted tools stained with blood, handcuffs, and a makeshift operating table covered in deep scratches and dried stains. Nearby, a collection of jars held teeth and fingernails, carefully preserved as if they were trophies. An old wooden trunk in his basement contained Polaroid photographs, hundreds of them, each depicting a different victim, some alive, some already dead, some in various stages of decomposition. The most horrifying revelation, however, came when they searched Carl's well, a deep, stone-lined pit just a few yards away from his house. Authorities had assumed it was abandoned, just another piece of old farm infrastructure. But when they removed the rotting wooden cover, the smell that erupted from it was indescribable. Using specialized equipment, they lowered a camera into the darkness, and what they saw made even the most seasoned officers turn away in disgust. At the bottom of the well, tangled together in a mass of decay, were dozens of human skulls. Some had been there for so long that the bone had turned brittle. Others were more recent, still clinging to patches of flesh. It became horrifyingly clear that Carl Henshaw had not just been disposing of his victims in the septic tank. He had been using multiple locations to hide his crimes. As the evidence piled up, the psychological weight of the case crushed the town. People who had once trusted Carl, who had invited him into their homes, who had even shared casual conversations with him, now realized that they had been living alongside a monster. Some of the victims' families had spent years searching for answers, hoping their loved ones had simply moved away or started new lives elsewhere. Now, they were faced with the unbearable truth. Their loved ones had been murdered and disposed of like waste, their final resting place a putrid pit of human remains and sewage. The town of Ridgeway would never be the same again. The discovery of Carl's true nature shattered its sense of safety. The idea that a man who had been part of their daily lives was secretly one of the most depraved killers in modern history was too much to process. Some refused to believe it at first. Some tried to erase every memory they had of Carl, and others simply packed their bags and left town, unable to exist in a place so tainted by horror. Even the lead investigators on the case were deeply affected. The sheer gruesomeness of Carl's crimes, the way he had calmly lived among his victims' families, fixing their sinks and unclogging their drains while their loved ones rotted beneath his feet, was something they would never forget. The case was now a national headline, drawing attention from criminologists, psychologists, and media outlets, all seeking to understand how a man like Carl Henshaw had managed to go unnoticed for so long. But while the town struggled to grasp the nightmare they had uncovered, Carl himself remained silent. He refused to speak during interrogations, his expression blank, his eyes empty. He did not fight the accusations. He did not deny what he had done. He simply sat there, as if he were completely detached from the horror he had created. Yet in the minds of those who had once called him a neighbor, there was only one question that mattered. Why? As the trial of Carl Henshaw began, the world turned its gaze toward Ridgeway. What had once been a small, forgotten town was now the center of one of the most disturbing murder cases in American history. National media outlets flooded the streets, cameras rolling as journalists scrambled to capture every detail of the case. True crime enthusiasts, criminal psychologists, and even FBI profilers all sought to understand the mind of the man who had lived among his victims, shared spaces with their grieving families, and disposed of bodies in the very systems meant to carry away waste. But Carl Henshaw was not an easy subject to analyze. Unlike most serial killers, he did not seek notoriety, nor did he leave behind a calling card. He was methodical, calculated, and, above all, coldly efficient in his work. Inside the courtroom, Carl sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He had refused to cooperate with investigators, refused to answer questions, and refused to explain his crimes. Some believed he was waiting. For what? No one knew. Others believed he simply did not care. His defense attorneys attempted to paint him as mentally unstable, citing possible schizophrenia, psychopathy, or dissociative identity disorder. But the prosecution argued something even more chilling. Carl Henshaw was not insane. He was fully aware of what he had done. He had planned, executed, and hid his crimes for decades, living a double life with disturbing precision. The testimonies of criminal psychologists and FBI profilers painted a deeply unsettling portrait of Carl. Unlike many serial killers who were driven by passion, anger, or uncontrollable urges, Carl was motivated by something far more insidious, a sense of purity. He saw himself as a cleaner, a remover of waste, both literal and metaphorical. In his mind, the people he killed were filth, individuals he deemed unworthy of existence. His victims were chosen seemingly at random, yet all of them had, in some way, crossed his path during his work. Some were rude customers, others were simply too inquisitive, and some, perhaps most disturbingly, were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. To Carl, they were all disposable, just like the sewage he worked with daily. During the trial, forensic analysts presented the gruesome evidence: the bones recovered from his septic tank, the well filled with human skulls, the videotapes, the personal belongings of his victims carefully stored in his basement. The jury shuddered as they watched footage from his tapes, recordings of unsuspecting victims talking, laughing, even sitting at his kitchen table before they were murdered. Carl had documented his own atrocities, not out of a need for remembrance, but as a ritual. He watched those tapes alone, in his dimly lit home, replaying the moments where he took control over another human life. One of the most haunting moments of the trial came when the prosecution displayed a ledger found in Carl's home. It contained names, dates, and chilling notes beside each entry. Some names had X's next to them. Those were the ones found in the septic tank. Others had question marks, likely intended victims who had unknowingly escaped their fate. The final pages of the ledger contained new names, people from town, some of whom were sitting in the very courtroom, neighbors, shopkeepers, even the sheriff. It became clear that Carl had never planned to stop. As the trial stretched on, families of the victims sat in silent grief, their faces pale and hollowed by the weight of their suffering. Some demanded the death penalty, wanting Carl to suffer the same fate he had inflicted on so many others. Others simply wanted to know why, an answer that never came. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent. Carl Henshaw was found guilty on all counts. Multiple charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, desecration of human remains, and obstruction of justice. The judge, unable to contain their disgust, sentenced him to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Yet, even as the gavel struck, Carl's expression never changed. He simply nodded, as if he had already accepted his fate long before his capture. As guards escorted him from the courtroom, a reporter shouted, "Why did you do it, Carl? What made you kill them?" For the first time, Carl stopped. He turned his head ever so slightly, and with a voice as calm as ever, he said, "Because it was easy." And just like that, he was gone, vanishing behind prison doors, leaving behind a trail of horror that would haunt Ridgeway forever. Even after Carl Henshaw was locked away, his presence still lingered over Ridgeway like a dark shadow that refused to lift. The town was never the same again. The discovery of his crimes had left an unhealable wound, one that stretched far beyond the families of the victims. People who had once prided themselves on the town's close-knit community now saw each other with suspicion. They had lived beside a monster for decades. They had spoken to him, trusted him, let him into their homes. The realization that they had unknowingly been in the presence of pure evil, left behind a paralyzing fear, a fear that would never fully fade. Many of the victims' families never recovered. Some moved away, unable to bear the sight of the places where their loved ones had last been seen. Some refused to sell their homes, clinging to what little they had left, a desperate attempt to hold on to the memories before the nightmare began. But for those who stayed, life became a daily struggle with paranoia. The once friendly neighborhood streets were now eerily quiet. Doors were triple locked. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Even the sound of a passing truck at night sent shivers down spines, a cruel reminder of how easily someone could disappear. Businesses suffered. People stopped calling for handymen, plumbers, or repair workers, afraid that another Carl Henshaw might be lurking among them. The local motel, once a quiet resting spot for travelers, was abandoned after it was revealed that one of Carl's earliest victims had last been seen checking in there before vanishing forever. Some streets were never the same, especially the ones where Carl had worked most often. The properties he had fixed, the yards he had mowed, the pipes he had repaired. Each one felt tainted, cursed, as if the walls themselves had absorbed his horrors. Some homes were left vacant, as their owners could not bear to live in a place where Carl had once walked freely. Psychologists and true crime experts continued to study Carl's case, trying to piece together the mind of a man who had fooled an entire town. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, yet no matter how much was uncovered, one question always remained unanswered. How many victims had there truly been? The official count, based on remains found in the septic tank, well, and other locations, stood at 32 confirmed murders, but investigators feared the real number could be far higher. Some victims may have been disposed of in places never discovered, their existence erased so thoroughly that no one would ever know they had once lived. Some cases remained open-ended, as bodies were too decomposed to be identified. And even more chillingly, there were still names in Carl's ledger that had never been found. Were they buried somewhere else, burned, or had he simply let some go, watching them from afar, knowing they would never know how close they came to death? Carl's house was bulldozed within weeks of his conviction, but even that did little to erase his legacy of terror. Some people believed the land itself was cursed, that the soil had soaked up too much death to ever be clean again. A few thrill-seekers and paranormal investigators tried to visit the site at night, convinced that spirits of his victims still lingered, but even they left quickly, saying the place felt wrong, like it was watching them. Ridgeway became a ghost town in spirit, even if people still lived there. The case of the septic tank killer was etched into history, a cautionary tale that would be told for generations. Parents warned their children to never trust a stranger, to always be aware of their surroundings. But the most terrifying part of all was the realization that no one had ever suspected him. If Carl Henshaw could live unnoticed among them for so long, who else out there was doing the same? The thought was enough to keep anyone from sleeping soundly ever again.
While passengers slept in their cabins on the night of April 14th, 1912, 5 men worked tirelessly in the belly of the Titanic, surrounded by 3,423 sacks of mail destined for New York. The ship's postal clerks, John Starr March, William Logan Gwynn, Oscar Scott Woody, John Richard Jago Smith and James Bertram Williamson, represented an international crew from America, Britain and Belgium, united by their dedication to the Royal Mail Service and the United States Postal Service. When the collision occurred at 11:40 p.m, these men didn't panic or abandon their post. Instead, they made a decision that would define their final hours. They would save as much mail as possible. Water began flooding the mailroom within minutes of impact, rising rapidly through the lower decks. The postal workers immediately began hauling mail sacks from the flooding G deck to the drier F deck, working by lamplight as the ship's power flickered uncertainly. What many don't realise is that these weren't just letters and packages. The mail carried irreplaceable documents, business contracts, immigration papers, and personal correspondence that represented lifelines for families separated by the Atlantic. The postal workers understood that each sack contained someone's hope, someone's future, and someone's connection to loved ones across the ocean. As the water continued to rise, the 5 men worked with methodical precision. They had trained for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of a sinking ship. The mailroom's location near the front of the vessel meant they were among the first to experience the full force of the flooding. Yet witness accounts from survivors indicate they continued working even as water reached their waists. John March, the chief postal clerk, had sailed on numerous Atlantic crossings and was respected by crew members for his calm demeanour under pressure. That night, he guided his team with the unwavering professionalism that characterised his entire career. The men worked in assembly line fashion, passing sacks from hand to hand, their movements becoming increasingly frantic as the water level rose. By midnight, the situation had become desperate. The postal workers had managed to relocate hundreds of mail sacks to higher decks, but the flooding was accelerating. The mailroom's electric lights had failed, leaving them to work by the dim glow of emergency lighting. Still, they persisted, driven by a sense of duty that transcended personal safety. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the water had risen to chest level in the mailroom. Despite acknowledging the loss of their battle, the 5 men remained unwavering in their dedication. Instead of immediately seeking lifeboats, they made one final effort to secure what mail they could in waterproof containers, hoping that some might survive even if they did not. The last confirmed sighting of the postal workers came at 1:30 a.m., just over an hour before the ship's final plunge. A surviving crew member reported seeing them still working on F-deck, now waist-deep in water, methodically securing mail sacks with rope and canvas. Their faces, illuminated by flickering emergency lights, showed exhaustion but not defeat. None of the 5 postal workers survived the disaster. Their bodies were never recovered, claimed by the same Atlantic waters that swallowed their carefully tended mail. However, their sacrifice wasn't entirely in vain. Several mail sacks were found floating in the debris field and were later recovered by rescue ships. Some letters, sealed in waterproof pouches, reached their intended recipients weeks later, bearing water stains that told their story of that terrible night. The postal workers' dedication became a symbol of professional honour and personal sacrifice. In an era when mail service was the primary means of long-distance communication, these 5 men understood that their work connected families, enabled commerce, and maintained the bonds that held communities together across vast distances. Their decision to prioritise duty over personal safety reflected values that defined their generation, values that would be tested again and again in the turbulent decades that followed. The story of the Titanic's band has been told countless times, but the deeper narrative of how music functioned as both comfort and communication during the disaster reveals layers of human psychology often overlooked. The 8 musicians aboard the ship, led by band leader Wallace Hartley, represented more than entertainment. They embodied the sophisticated cultural aspirations of Edwardian society and the belief that civilization could triumph over chaos through art and refinement. Wallace Hartley, a 33-year-old from Yorkshire, had assembled his ensemble with meticulous care. Each musician brought unique skills and backgrounds that reflected the international nature of the ship's passenger list. The band included violinists, cellists and pianists who had performed in some of Europe's finest hotels and concert halls. They weren't merely ship's entertainers, but accomplished artists who had chosen maritime work for its steady income and opportunities to travel. What made their final performance extraordinary wasn't just their decision to keep playing, but their sophisticated understanding of music's psychological impact. As the ship listed and panic spread, Hartley made calculated choices about repertoire. The band initially played upbeat ragtime numbers and popular songs to maintain normalcy and prevent mass hysteria. They understood that familiar melodies could provide psychological anchors in a situation where reality had become incomprehensible. The musicians positioned themselves strategically on the boat deck, where their music could reach the maximum number of passengers. Their location wasn't accidental. Hartley had studied the ship's acoustics during the voyage and knew exactly where sound would carry most effectively. As lifeboats were lowered, the band's music provided a sonic backdrop that helped maintain order during the evacuation process. Survivor testimonies reveal that the band's music evolved throughout the night, reflecting the changing psychology of the disaster. As the situation became increasingly desperate, Hartley transitioned from popular entertainment to hymns and classical pieces. This shift wasn't random, but represented a deliberate attempt to provide spiritual comfort as hope for survival diminished. The choice of "Nearer, My God, to Thee" as their final selection has been debated for over a century, but multiple survivors confirmed hearing hymns during the ship's final minutes. What's remarkable is that the musicians continued playing even as the deck tilted at increasingly severe angles, making it physically difficult to maintain their instruments and their balance. Their commitment transcended mere professionalism. It became an act of defiance against the chaos surrounding them. The band's performance also served a practical purpose that historians often overlook. Their music masked the sounds of the ship's death throes, the groaning of metal, the rushing of water, and the mechanical failures that accompanied the sinking. By providing an alternative auditory focus, they helped prevent the complete psychological breakdown that might have occurred if passengers had been forced to listen only to the ship's destruction. Each musician made a personal choice to remain with the band rather than seek survival. Roger Brousseau, the young French cellist, had written to his family about his excitement for the voyage. Percy Taylor, the pianist, had planned to marry his fiancée upon returning to London. These men sacrificed their individual futures for what they perceived as a greater good, the maintenance of human dignity in the face of catastrophe. The musicians' dedication influenced other crew members and passengers. Their example of selfless service inspired acts of heroism throughout the ship. Stewards continued serving passengers, engineers remained at their posts to maintain power, and wireless operators stayed at their equipment sending distress signals. The band's music became the soundtrack for countless individual acts of courage and sacrifice. The cultural impact of the musicians' final performance extended far beyond the disaster itself. Their story became a template for how artists should respond to crisis, not by seeking personal safety, but by using their talents to serve others. This narrative resonated particularly strongly in the years following the disaster, as Europe moved toward World War I and society grappled with questions about individual responsibility and collective sacrifice. The band's instruments, lost with the ship, became symbols of artistic dedication. Music halls and concert venues across Britain and America held memorial concerts, with orchestras playing the same pieces that had echoed across the North Atlantic on that April night. Their sacrifice transformed music from entertainment into a form of moral witness, demonstrating art's power to provide meaning and comfort even in humanity's darkest hours. 20 miles away from the dying Titanic, the cargo ship SS Californian sat motionless in the ice field, her engines stopped for the night. Captain Stanley Lord had made the prudent decision to halt his vessel until daylight, avoiding the dangerous ice that had claimed the supposedly unsinkable ship. What transpired aboard the Californian during the next several hours would become one of maritime history's most contentious debates, raising questions about moral responsibility, professional duty, and the weight of decisions made in uncertainty. The Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had shut down his radio equipment at 11:30 p.m., just 10 minutes before the Titanic struck the iceberg. This timing wasn't coincidental. Evans had worked a long day and followed standard procedures for merchant vessels, which typically didn't maintain 24-hour radio watches. The economic realities of shipping meant that most vessels carried only one wireless operator, making continuous communication impossible. What the Californian's crew did see were mysterious lights and rockets in the distance. Third Officer Charles Groves first spotted a large steamer approaching around 11 p.m., describing it as a passenger vessel with multiple rows of lights. The ship appeared to be moving slowly, then seemed to stop. Crew members reported seeing white rockets fired from the distant vessel throughout the night. Captain Lord's response to these sightings reveals the complexity of maritime decision-making in an era before modern communication. When informed about the rockets, he inquired whether they were company signals, coloured flares used by shipping lines to communicate with their vessels. White rockets, while typically distress signals, could also be used for other purposes. Lord's caution reflected both professional conservatism and the practical realities of command in dangerous waters. The Californian's crew continued watching the mysterious vessel throughout the night. Second Officer Herbert Stone observed approximately 8 rockets fired at intervals, noting that the ship appeared to be moving away and eventually disappeared. Stone reported these observations to Captain Lord, who was resting in the chart room. The captain's responses, asking about the colour of the rockets and instructing the crew to continue monitoring, suggest a commander wrestling with incomplete information and multiple possible interpretations. The Californian's tragedy is the gap between what the crew saw and what they understood, not malice. The ship's officers were experienced mariners who had spent their careers in merchant service, where distress situations were relatively rare. Their training and experience didn't prepare them for the possibility that they were witnessing the death of 1,500 people just beyond the horizon. Captain Lord's decision to remain stationary became the focus of intense scrutiny during the British Board of Trade inquiry. Lord maintained that his ship was too far away to reach the Titanic in time, and that the vessel his crew observed was not the White Star liner, but another ship entirely. This position wasn't entirely implausible. The ice field contained multiple vessels that night, and visual identification across 20 miles of dark water presented significant challenges. The inquiry's criticism of Captain Lord reflected broader questions about professional responsibility and moral duty. Should a ship's captain risk his vessel and crew based on ambiguous signals? How much certainty is required before taking potentially dangerous action? These questions extended beyond maritime law into fundamental issues of human responsibility and the obligations we have to strangers in distress. The Californian controversy also highlighted the technological limitations of the era. The ship carried wireless equipment, but operated it intermittently. Navigation relied on dead reckoning and celestial observation. Communication between vessels depended on visual signals, flags, and Morse lamps. In this context, the failure to respond to the Titanic's distress calls wasn't necessarily negligence, but rather a consequence of technological and organizational limitations. The debate over the Californians' actions continued for decades, dividing maritime experts and historians. Some argued that Captain Lord was a scapegoat for systemic failures in maritime safety. Others maintained that his inaction represented a fundamental failure of moral courage. The controversy reflected deeper cultural tensions about individual responsibility versus institutional accountability. The case influenced maritime law and practices for generations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, adopted in 1914, mandated continuous radio watches on passenger vessels. The Californian incident became a case study in maritime academies, teaching future officers about the weight of command decisions and the importance of acting on incomplete information when lives might be at stake. Captain Lord's reputation never fully recovered from the inquiry's findings. He spent the remainder of his career defending his actions, arguing that he had followed proper procedures and made reasonable decisions based on available information. His supporters maintained that he became a scapegoat for broader failures in maritime safety regulation and ship design that had made the Titanic disaster possible. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's chief designer, walked through his creation's tilting corridors with the methodical precision of a man conducting his autopsy. At 39 years old, Andrews represented the pinnacle of naval architecture, a profession that combined artistic vision with mathematical precision. His presence aboard the ship during its maiden voyage wasn't ceremonial, but reflected his deep personal investment in every rivet, every bulkhead, and every design decision that had transformed blueprints into the largest moving object ever created by human hands. Andrews had spent 3 years perfecting the Titanic's design, working from his offices at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. His approach to ship design was revolutionary for its time, emphasizing not just size and luxury but also safety features that went beyond regulatory requirements. The ship's watertight compartments, double hull, and advanced pumping systems represented the most sophisticated maritime safety technology available in 1912. The designer's confidence in his creation wasn't mere arrogance, but reflected genuine technological achievement. The Titanic incorporated innovations that would influence ship design for decades: electric lighting throughout the vessel, advanced ventilation systems, and structural engineering that distributed weight more effectively than any previous ship. Andrews had studied every maritime disaster of the previous century, incorporating lessons learned into his design. When the collision occurred, Andrews immediately understood what others couldn't accept. His ship was doomed. His intimate knowledge of the vessel's construction allowed him to calculate the flooding rate and recognize that the damage exceeded the ship's survivability threshold. The iceberg had breached 5 compartments, while the ship could survive flooding in only 4. Such an event wasn't a failure of design, but rather an impact that exceeded the disaster scenarios Andrews had planned for. The designer's actions during the ship's final hours revealed both his technical expertise and his moral character. He moved through the vessel with a blueprint in his mind, directing passengers towards safety and advising crew members on the ship's condition. His presence provided crucial technical guidance during the evacuation, helping officers understand which areas would flood first and which routes would remain passable longest. Andrew's relationship with the ship transcended professional duty. He had overseen every aspect of construction, from the selection of steel to the positioning of lifeboats. The vessel represented not just his career achievement, but also his vision of how technology could enhance human experience. The ship's grand staircase, luxurious staterooms, and innovative amenities reflected his belief that engineering should serve beauty as well as function. The tragic irony of Andrew's situation was that his design had actually performed better than regulations required. The ship's watertight compartments had functioned correctly, slowing the flooding and providing crucial time for evacuation. The electrical systems had maintained power longer than expected, keeping lights functioning and wireless equipment operational. The ship's structural integrity had held long enough to allow the launching of lifeboats, despite damage that would have sunk lesser vessels immediately. Andrew's final hours demonstrated the complex relationship between engineering confidence and human fallibility. His design had accounted for collision scenarios, fire dangers, and mechanical failures, but the specific nature of the iceberg impact, a glancing blow that opened multiple compartments simultaneously, represented a catastrophic failure mode that existing technology couldn't address. The disaster revealed the limitations of engineering hubris while simultaneously showcasing the designer's technical competence. The designer's presence aboard the ship during its maiden voyage reflected standard practice for significant vessels. Naval architects often sailed on initial crossings to observe their creations under operational conditions, making notes for future improvements. Andrews had planned to document the ship's performance, gathering data that would influence the design of the third Olympic-class vessel, the Britannic. His death represented not just personal tragedy, but the loss of invaluable technical knowledge. Andrews possessed a detailed understanding of the ship's construction, knowledge that died with him. His notes and observations about the vessel's performance during the disaster could have been vital to future ship design, but these insights were lost when he chose to remain aboard rather than seek survival. The designer's legacy extended far beyond the Titanic disaster. His innovations in ship construction influenced maritime design for decades, contributing to safer and more efficient vessels. The lessons learned from the Titanic's sinking, combined with Andrews' previous design work, helped establish new standards for maritime safety that prevented similar disasters. Andrews' story exemplifies the moral complexity of technological disaster. His design wasn't flawed, but rather faced circumstances that exceeded its intended parameters. The tragedy wasn't that he created an unsafe ship, but that he had created a vessel that, while revolutionary for its time, couldn't survive an impact that no ship of that era could have withstood. His death represented not the failure of engineering, but the limitations of human foresight in the face of unpredictable catastrophe. In the Titanic's Marconi room, 2 men worked frantically at equipment that represented the cutting edge of early 20th century communication technology. Jack Phillips, 25, and Harold Bride, 22, were part of an elite group of wireless operators who had mastered the complex art of Morse code transmission across vast oceanic distances. Their work that night would demonstrate both the revolutionary potential and the crucial limitations of wireless communication in its infancy. The Marconi system aboard the Titanic marked a significant advancement in maritime communication. Previous generations of ships had relied on visual signals, flags, and signal lamps, methods that worked only in clear weather and daylight hours. Wireless telegraphy promised to connect ships with shore stations and other vessels regardless of weather conditions or time of day. For the first time in maritime history, a ship in distress could summon help from hundreds of miles away. Phillips, the senior operator, had spent the day before the collision working through a massive backlog of passenger messages. The ship's wealthy passengers had discovered the novelty of sending wireless messages from mid-ocean, creating unprecedented demand for communication services. These personal messages, business correspondence, social notes, and family communications took priority over routine ship-to-ship traffic, a decision that would later prove controversial. The wireless operators worked in shifts, but the equipment required constant maintenance and adjustment. The Marconi transmitter was temperamental, requiring skilled operators who could troubleshoot technical problems while maintaining communication schedules. The apparatus filled a small room with complex machinery, including spark gap transmitters, receivers, and the emergency backup equipment that would prove crucial during the disaster. When the collision occurred, Phillips immediately began transmitting the international distress signal, CQD, a call that meant all stations distress. The signal was relatively new, having been adopted only 6 years earlier as ships began carrying wireless equipment. Phillips alternated between CQD and the newer SOS signal, trying to reach any ship within wireless range of the Titanic's powerful transmitter. The initial response to the distress calls was frustratingly slow. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, responded first, but her wireless operator had been about to shut down for the night. Other ships were either too far away or had already closed their wireless rooms. The Frankfurt, a German vessel, responded, but was over 150 miles distant. The technological limitation of wireless communication meant that help, while theoretically available, remained practically out of reach. Phillips' transmission technique revealed both his skill and the limitations of early wireless equipment. He had to manually adjust the transmitter's power and frequency while simultaneously operating the Morse key. The ship's electrical system, damaged by the collision, provided inconsistent power that affected transmission quality. Despite these challenges, Phillips maintained almost continuous communication with shore stations and other vessels. Harold Bride, the junior operator, worked to maintain the backup equipment and assist with message transmission. His role became increasingly crucial as the main transmitter began failing. The 2 men worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that their ability to communicate the ship's position and condition would determine whether rescue vessels could reach survivors in time. The wireless operators' work that night demonstrated the international nature of maritime communication. They communicated with German, British, and American vessels, coordinating rescue efforts across national boundaries. Coastal stations relayed their messages to shipping companies and government agencies, establishing a communication network spanning the Atlantic Ocean. As the ship's electrical power failed, the wireless operators switched to emergency batteries, maintaining transmission capability even as the vessel listed severely. Their dedication to maintaining communication continued until the very end. Phillips was last seen at his equipment, sending distress signals even as water flooded the wireless room. His commitment to duty ensured that rescue vessels had accurate information about the disaster's location and the number of survivors. The wireless operators' heroism extended beyond their technical skills to their decision-making under extreme pressure. They prioritized distress signals over personal safety, recognizing that their ability to communicate with potential rescue vessels represented the difference between life and death for hundreds of survivors. Their actions demonstrated how technology could amplify human courage and determination. Bride's survival provided crucial testimony about the disaster's final hours. His account of the wireless room's operations, the sequence of distress calls, and the responses from other vessels became essential evidence in subsequent investigations. His testimony helped establish the timeline of events and identified both the heroes and the failures in the maritime communication system. The wireless operator's story illustrated the paradox of technological progress, advanced communication systems that could reach across thousands of miles, but remained dependent on human operators who worked limited hours and followed commercial rather than safety priorities. Their heroism highlighted both the potential and the limitations of early 20th century technology, foreshadowing the communication systems that would eventually make such disasters impossible. In the depths of the Titanic's third-class compartments, hundreds of immigrants carried more than just luggage. They transported dreams, hopes, and the accumulated savings of entire families who had invested everything in passage to America. These passengers, often overlooked in accounts that focus on wealthy first-class victims, represented the human tide of early 20th century immigration that would reshape American society. Their stories reveal the complex motivations, expectations, and tragedies that defined the immigrant experience. The ship's third-class accommodations, while basic by the standards of first-class luxury, represented significant improvements over typical steerage conditions. The White Star Line had designed these spaces to attract immigrants willing to pay premium prices for better treatment during the Atlantic crossing. Private cabins, electric lighting, and improved ventilation systems made the Titanic's third-class passage more comfortable than the crowded dormitories common on other vessels. Among the third-class passengers were families who had sold farms, businesses, and family possessions to finance their journey. The Sage family from England travelled with 11 members, including 9 children, seeking agricultural opportunities in the American West. Their decision to emigrate reflected not desperation but calculated optimism about America's expanding economy and the opportunities it offered for skilled workers and entrepreneurs. The linguistic diversity of third-class passengers created a complex social dynamic aboard the ship. Italian stonemasons, Swedish farmers, Irish labourers, and Lebanese merchants shared dining rooms and social spaces, creating temporary communities that bridged cultural and national boundaries. These interactions provided glimpses of the multicultural society that America was becoming, as immigrants learned to navigate cultural differences while maintaining their distinct identities. Many third-class passengers carried documents that represented their life's achievements, apprenticeship certificates, letters of recommendation, and family records that would establish their credibility in America. These papers, carefully preserved through the Atlantic crossing, would have enabled immigrants to find employment and establish themselves in their new country. The loss of these documents in the disaster represented not just personal tragedy, but the erasure of human capital that could have contributed to American economic development. The social dynamics of third-class passengers during the disaster revealed both the limitations and the humanity of early 20th century social hierarchies. While barriers existed between passenger classes, emergency conditions broke down some of these distinctions. Crew members directed third-class passengers toward lifeboats, and some survived alongside wealthy first-class passengers. However, the ship's design and evacuation procedures still reflected class-based assumptions about passenger priority. The immigrants' responses to the disaster varied based on their cultural backgrounds and previous experiences. Scandinavian passengers, familiar with maritime travel, often understood the gravity of the situation more quickly than those from landlocked regions. Italian and Lebanese passengers, accustomed to extended family networks, often stayed together as groups, sometimes hindering evacuation efforts but providing emotional support during the crisis. The economic impact of the disaster on immigrant communities extended far beyond the immediate victims. Relatives already in America had sponsored many passengers, providing passage money and guaranteeing employment. The loss of these immigrants disrupted carefully planned family reunifications and economic strategies that had taken years to develop. Entire communities in America mourned relatives they had never met, but had eagerly anticipated welcoming. The survival stories of third-class passengers often demonstrated resourcefulness and determination that reflected their immigrant experience. These were people accustomed to overcoming obstacles, navigating bureaucratic systems, and adapting to unfamiliar environments. Their ability to survive the disaster often depended on skills they had developed during their journey to America: language abilities, cultural adaptability, and the capacity to make quick decisions under pressure. The tragedy also revealed the vulnerability of immigrant communities to disasters that affected transportation systems. Unlike wealthy passengers who could afford multiple attempts at ocean crossing, many third-class passengers had invested their life savings in a single journey. The disaster's impact on these families was therefore catastrophic, eliminating not just lives, but the economic foundations that had made immigration possible. The cultural memory of the disaster varied significantly among different immigrant communities. Italian Americans, Scandinavian Americans, and other ethnic groups created their own narratives about the tragedy, often emphasizing the courage and sacrifice of their compatriots. These stories became part of the broader immigrant experience, demonstrating how newcomers to America had faced and overcome extraordinary challenges. The loss of third-class passengers represented more than individual tragedy. It symbolized the interruption of America's great immigration wave. Each victim had represented potential contributions to American society: skilled craftsmen, ambitious entrepreneurs, and young families who would have strengthened the nation's economic and cultural foundation. Their deaths reminded the world that the promise of America remained vulnerable to the same natural and technological forces that affected all humanity. The RMS Carpathia, sailing from New York to the Mediterranean, received the Titanic's distress signal at 12:35 a.m. on April 15, 1912. Captain Arthur Rostron's immediate response would transform him from an obscure merchant captain into a maritime hero, demonstrating how individual leadership can triumph over impossible circumstances. His ship's race through the ice fields to reach the disaster site became one of the most dramatic rescue operations in maritime history. Captain Rostron faced an extraordinary challenge when wireless operator Harold Cottam brought him the Titanic's distress message. The Carpathia was 58 miles away, travelling at her normal speed of 14 knots. To reach the disaster site before survivors succumbed to hypothermia, Rostron would need to push his ship beyond its design limits, while navigating the same ice field that had destroyed the unsinkable Titanic. His decision to attempt the rescue required both technical expertise and moral courage. The Carpathia's crew responded to Rostron's emergency orders with remarkable efficiency. Engineers pushed the ship's engines to 17 knots, a speed that strained every component of the vessel's propulsion system. Additional stokers fed the furnaces, creating steam pressure that exceeded normal operating parameters. The ship's medical staff prepared for mass casualties, setting up treatment areas and gathering supplies for hundreds of potential survivors. Rostron's navigation through the ice field demonstrated masterful seamanship. He positioned extra lookouts, increased lighting, and personally directed the ship's course through waters that had claimed the world's largest passenger vessel just hours earlier. The captain's ability to maintain maximum speed while avoiding ice required constant adjustments and split-second decisions that could have resulted in a second maritime disaster. The Carpathia's wireless operator maintained continuous communication with other vessels, coordinating rescue efforts and providing updates on the ship's progress. This communication network enabled other vessels to adjust their courses and assist in the rescue operation. The Frankfurt, Olympic, and other ships altered their routes to provide backup assistance, creating an impromptu maritime rescue fleet. When the Carpathia reached the disaster site at 3:30 a.m., the crew faced the horrifying reality of the Atlantic's deadliest peacetime maritime disaster. The ship's crew had prepared for hundreds of survivors, but they found only 705 people in 20 lifeboats scattered across miles of debris-filled ocean. The water temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit had killed most of those who had entered the water, leaving floating corpses and debris as the only evidence of the Titanic's 2,224 passengers and crew. The rescue operation required precise coordination and emotional strength. Carpathia's crew lowered rope ladders and rigged pulley systems to bring survivors aboard. Many passengers were suffering from hypothermia and required immediate medical attention. Overwhelming the ship's limited medical facilities, crew members prioritized providing basic care to the most seriously injured survivors. The Carpathia's passengers, originally bound for Mediterranean vacations, immediately opened their cabins and personal belongings to Titanic survivors. This spontaneous generosity demonstrated the human capacity for compassion during crisis. Passengers shared clothing, food, and personal items with survivors who had lost everything. The ship's dining rooms became refugee centres, providing warmth and comfort to people who had experienced unimaginable trauma. Captain Rostron's decisions during the rescue operation revealed both his humanitarian instincts and his practical understanding of maritime law. He ordered the recovery of bodies floating in the water, recognizing the importance of providing closure to families and gathering evidence for future investigations. The ship's crew also collected debris that might provide clues about the disaster's cause, preserving evidence that would prove crucial in subsequent inquiries. The return journey to New York became a period of mourning and reflection. Survivors began processing their experiences, sharing stories that would become the foundation of historical accounts. The ship's wireless operator worked continuously, sending survivor lists to anxious relatives and providing updates to news organizations. These communications created the first detailed accounts of the disaster, shaping public understanding of the tragedy. The Carpathia's arrival in New York Harbor on April 18th marked the beginning of the disaster's aftermath. Thousands of people gathered at the docks, seeking information about relatives and friends. The ship's passengers and crew had become unwilling participants in one of history's most significant news events, their actions scrutinized by investigators, journalists, and the public. The rescue operation's success resulted from the convergence of individual heroism, technological capability, and maritime tradition. Captain Rostron's leadership, his crew's dedication, and the ship's mechanical reliability enabled the rescue of 705 survivors who would have died without intervention. Their actions demonstrated the triumph of human courage and technical competence over natural forces, even in the face of unprecedented disaster. The Carpathia's role in the Titanic rescue became a template for maritime emergency response. The ship's crew had improvised solutions to unprecedented challenges, creating procedures that would influence rescue operations for decades. Their experience demonstrated the importance of preparation, leadership, and international cooperation in responding to maritime disasters. The rescue operation's psychological impact on the Carpathia's crew and passengers extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. Many participants in the rescue suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, haunted by the scenes of death and suffering they had witnessed. Their sacrifice, the interruption of their journeys to save strangers, exemplified the maritime tradition of mutual assistance that remains fundamental to ocean travel. The story of the Carpathia's rescue mission ultimately became a testament to human resilience and the power of individual action in the face of catastrophe. Captain Rostron's decision to risk his ship and crew to save Titanic survivors demonstrated that heroes emerge not from extraordinary circumstances, but from ordinary people who choose to act with courage when confronted with human suffering. Dr. Margaret Holloway had spent 17 years cataloguing medieval manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, but she had never encountered anything quite like the water-damaged codex that arrived on her desk that October morning. The leather binding bore no identifying marks, and the pages within seemed to shift between Latin, Old French, and symbols she couldn't immediately recognize. The manuscript had been recovered from a flooded basement in Troyes, the ancient capital of Champagne, where the Knights Templar had first been officially recognized by the Catholic Church in 1129. Construction workers had discovered a sealed chamber beneath what had once been the city's medieval quarter, and the flood had damaged but not destroyed its contents. Margaret's specialty was paleography, the study of ancient writing systems, but this document challenged her expertise. The ink appeared to be iron gall, consistent with medieval texts, yet certain passages seemed to have been written with a different substance entirely. Under ultraviolet light, these sections revealed additional text overlaying the visible writing, resulting in an extraordinary complex palimpsest. As she worked through the morning, Margaret began to notice patterns. The mysterious symbols weren't random decorative elements, but appeared to be a sophisticated cipher system. More intriguingly, they seem to correspond to specific geographic locations mentioned in the Latin text. The document wasn't just a historical record, it was a map of sorts, encoded in a way that would have been invisible to casual readers. The first breakthrough came when Margaret recognised a passage describing the arrest of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, in 1307. But this account differed significantly from the historical record. According to the manuscript, de Molay had been warned of the impending arrests 3 days in advance by a network of sympathisers within the court of King Philip IV. The warning had given the Templars time to implement what the text referred to as the Great Concealment. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she translated the next section. Historians had long assumed that the Templars had not escaped unprepared. They had systematically moved their most valuable assets, not just gold and silver, but something the text called the Foundation of Understanding, to locations across Europe. The operation had been planned for years, a contingency protocol known only to the highest-ranking members of the Order. The document suggested that the legendary Templar treasure was never a single hoard, but a distributed network of caches, each containing different components of what the Knights had considered their true legacy. The monetary wealth was apparently the least significant part. References to the Scrolls of the First Knowledge and the Instruments of Heavenly Calculation suggested that the Templars had possessed texts and devices of far greater historical importance. Margaret photographed each page with meticulous care, noting the precise location of every symbol and mark. The cipher patterns were becoming clearer, revealing what appeared to be a sequence of locations spanning from Scotland to the eastern Mediterranean. Each location was marked with specific astronomical references, suggesting that the hiding places were meant to be found only by someone with knowledge of medieval astronomy and mathematics. That evening, in her apartment overlooking the Seine, Margaret spread photocopies of the manuscript across her dining table. She had contacted 2 colleagues, one a specialist in medieval French history, the other an expert in cryptography. Both had agreed to meet her the following morning, but she hadn't told them the full scope of what she believed she had discovered. The implications were staggering. If the manuscript was authentic, it suggested that the Knights Templar had possessed knowledge and artifacts that had been deliberately hidden from the world for over 7 centuries. The document appeared to be not just a historical record, but a guide for someone who knew how to read its embedded instructions. As midnight approached, Margaret realised she had uncovered something that would change the understanding of medieval history. The question was no longer whether the Templar treasure existed, but whether she was prepared for the consequences of revealing its true nature. 3 days later, Margaret found herself on a train to Edinburgh, accompanied by Dr. James Morrison, a medievalist from Cambridge, who had specialised in the Knights Templars' activities in Scotland. His reaction to the manuscript had been immediate and intense. He had cancelled his lectures and booked them flights within hours of seeing Margaret's translations. The astronomical references in your document correspond perfectly with the alignment of Rosslyn Chapel, Morrison explained, as Scottish countryside rolled past their window. But more importantly, they match calculations I've found in other fragmentary sources that nobody has been able to connect before. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century by the St. Clair family, had long been associated with Templar legends. The elaborate stone carvings that covered every surface had been interpreted as everything from Christian symbolism to pagan imagery to Masonic codes, but Morrison believed the Paris manuscript provided the key to understanding what the chapel's builders had actually intended. They met with Dr. Sarah MacLeod, the chapel's chief historian, on a grey Thursday morning. MacLeod had been researching the building's mysteries for 20 years, and she led them through the chapel while explaining her theories about its construction. The official story is that William Street Clare built the structure as a family chapel, MacLeod said, pointing to intricate stone pillars that supported the roof. But the level of symbolic complexity suggests something far more significant. The St. Clair family had documented connections to the Knights Templar. Margaret matched the symbols in the manuscript with the carvings on the stone, a discovery that caused her heartbeat to quicken. The chapel's architecture appeared to replicate the cipher system she had identified in the Paris Codex. The manuscript's geographic markers corresponded to specific combinations of carved symbols, encoding a 3-dimensional map in stone. Morrison had been studying the famous Apprentice Pillar, a column covered in spiral carvings that had puzzled scholars for centuries. Margaret, Your manuscript mentions the instruments of heavenly calculation. I think this pillar is one of them. The spiral carvings, when viewed from specific angles, revealed mathematical relationships that corresponded to astronomical calculations. The pillar wasn't just decorative, it was a computational device designed to calculate celestial positions and cycles. The St. Clair family had built the chapel not just as a hiding place for physical treasures, but as a repository for the Templars' scientific knowledge. MacLeod led them to the chapel's basement, where recent archaeological work had revealed older foundations beneath the 15th century structure. The basement excavations had revealed a chamber containing a single large stone block, carved with symbols that matched those in the Paris manuscript. "This isn't a foundation stone," Margaret said, running her hands over the carved symbols. "It's a key. These symbols follow the same sequence as the cipher in the manuscript, but they're arranged in a pattern that shows how to locate the other caches." The implications were becoming clear. The Templars had created a network of interconnected hiding places, each one containing clues to the locations of the others. Rosslyn Chapel wasn't just a repository, it was the central hub of a distribution system that had been designed to preserve the Order's knowledge for future generations. As they prepared to leave, Margaret noticed something that made her stop. The late afternoon sun was shining through the chapel's windows at an angle that illuminated specific carved symbols while leaving others in shadow. The illuminated symbols spelled out a message in the same cipher system used in the manuscript. "The light patterns change throughout the day," MacLeod explained. "We've documented them, but we never understood their significance." Margaret realised that the chapel had been designed as a time-sensitive message system. Different symbols would be illuminated at different times of day and seasons, creating a complex schedule of coded communications. The Templars had built a building that would continue to transmit their secrets for centuries, waiting for someone who understood their cipher system to decode the messages. Margaret's investigation took an unexpected turn when she received an encrypted email from Dr. Marco Benedetti at the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice. Benedetti claimed to have discovered a companion manuscript that would change everything she thought she knew about the Templar treasure. The manuscript had been catalogued as a 14th century merchant's ledger, but Benedetti's examination had revealed it was actually a sophisticated double document with a complete second text hidden beneath the visible commercial records. The hidden text was written in the same cipher system Margaret had identified, and it contained information suggesting the Templars had established a financial network that extended far beyond their known operations. Margaret flew to Venice the following week, leaving Morrison to continue his research at Rosslyn Chapel. Benedetti met her at the airport, his excitement barely contained as he described his discovery. The Templars weren't just warriors and bankers, he explained, as their water taxi navigated the Grand Canal. They were operating a sophisticated information network that connected Europe with the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and possibly even regions beyond the Mediterranean. The Biblioteca Marciana housed manuscripts dating back to the Byzantine period. Benedetti led Margaret through the library's climate-controlled manuscript room, where the Venice Codex waited on a specialised reading stand. The hidden text, revealed through careful application of chemical reagents, described a system of communication and resource distribution that had operated for over a century before the Templars' official suppression. The network had included merchants, scholars and religious figures throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, many of whom had no direct connection to the Templar Order, but who shared the Knights' commitment to preserving knowledge. It described something called the Translation Project, Benedetti said, pointing to a passage Margaret translated as she read. The Templars were systematically acquiring and translating texts from Arabic, Greek and Hebrew sources, creating a library of knowledge that would have been unprecedented in medieval Europe. The translation project had been far more ambitious than the preservation of individual manuscripts. The Templars had been working to create a comprehensive understanding of mathematics, astronomy, medicine and philosophy that drew from sources across the known world. Their treasure wasn't just gold and silver, it was an intellectual legacy that represented centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Margaret spent 3 days working through the Venice manuscript, gradually piecing together the structure of the Templar network. The system had been designed to survive the destruction of the Order itself, with each node capable of operating independently, while maintaining contact with the others. The manuscript mentions a master archive, Margaret told Benedetti. It was apparently the central repository for the most important texts and artifacts. The location is encoded using the same cipher system as the other documents. Benedetti had been studying the financial records hidden within the merchant's ledger, identifying patterns that suggested the Templars had been moving resources to specific locations for decades before their suppression. They weren't just hiding treasure, they were funding a continuation of their work under different auspices. Margaret realised that the Templars' true legacy wasn't hidden in remote castles or buried in secret chambers. The intellectual development of European civilization itself embedded the Templars' legacy. The knowledge they had preserved and transmitted had contributed to the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the development of modern scholarship. The Venice manuscript contained references to other documents in the network, including ones in libraries in Prague, Oxford, and Constantinople. Each location was marked with specific symbols that corresponded to the cipher system Margaret had been studying. The Templars had established a distributed library system that endured for centuries, concealed within the collections of prominent European institutions. Margaret's research led her to Prague, where the manuscript trail pointed to the medieval collections of the Clementinum Library. She had arranged to meet with Dr. Thomas Novak, a specialist in Central Medieval European history, who had been intrigued by her description of the interconnected manuscript network. Prague in November was cold and atmospheric, with morning fog rolling off the Vltava River. Margaret found herself walking through cobblestone streets that had remained largely unchanged since the 14th century, when the Templars' network had been at its height. Novak met her at the Clementinum, the vast Baroque library complex that incorporated much older manuscript collections. He had been researching the library's medieval holdings for years, and Margaret's descriptions of the cipher system had helped him identify several documents that he had previously dismissed as routine religious texts. The cipher appears in at least 12 different manuscripts in our collection, Novak explained as they walked through the library's magnificent Baroque reading room. Without knowing what to look for, they would seem completely unrelated. Margaret examined the manuscripts that Novak had identified, finding consistent patterns that confirmed her growing understanding of the Templar network's scope. The Prague documents contained detailed information about the movement of scholars and texts between universities in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and Prague itself. One manuscript, ostensibly a 14th century treatise on canon law, contained hidden passages describing the establishment of preservation centres throughout Central Europe. These centres were designed to maintain copies of important texts and to continue the translation project even after the Templars' official suppression. The most interesting document is this one, Novak said, showing Margaret a manuscript that appeared to be a collection of astronomical tables. The calculations are far more sophisticated than anything we would expect from the 14th century. They include corrections for celestial mechanics that weren't officially discovered until the 16th century. Margaret studied the astronomical manuscript, recognizing symbols from the cipher system she had been tracking. The document wasn't just recording celestial observations, it was using astronomical calculations to encode the locations of other manuscripts and preservation centres. The Templars had created a star map that served as a guide to their hidden network. Novak led her to the library's astronomical tower, where medieval scholars had made observations that contributed to the development of European astronomy. Margaret found striking similarities between the tower's design and the computational elements she had identified in Rosslyn Chapel. Margaret informed Novak that the Templars were not merely preserving knowledge, they were actively advancing it. The network was designed to facilitate original research, not just preservation. The Prague manuscripts contained references to collaboration between scholars in different cities, describing joint projects that had continued for decades. The Templars had established a system of scholarly communication that had operated independently of official church and university channels. The most significant discovery came when Margaret identified a manuscript that appeared to be a master index to the entire network. Written in multiple languages and cipher systems, the document referenced hundreds of preserved texts and artifacts across Europe. This suggests that the Templars maintained their network for at least a century after their official suppression, Novak said, as Margaret translated sections of the index. Some of these references date to the early 15th century. Margaret realized that the Templar network had evolved into something resembling a secret university system, with scholars throughout Europe participating in collaborative research projects while maintaining their official positions within conventional institutions. Margaret's investigation reached its climax when she received messages from colleagues in Istanbul and Boston, both claiming to have discovered evidence that the Templar network had extended far beyond Europe. Dr. Yuki Tanaka in Istanbul had found Ottoman manuscripts describing the network's continuation under Islamic protection, while Dr. Robert Whitman at Harvard had identified connections to early American institutions. The evidence from Istanbul was particularly remarkable. The Ottoman sultans had apparently not only tolerated the continuation of the Templar network, but had actively supported it, recognizing the value of maintaining connections to European intellectual centers. Documents in the Suleymaniye Library described collaborative research projects involving scholars from multiple traditions, working together to translate and preserve ancient texts. The network wasn't just European, Margaret realized as she studied photographs of the Ottoman manuscripts. It was truly international, with connections to Islamic scholarship centers and Byzantine institutions. The Templars had created something unprecedented, a multicultural knowledge network that transcended religious and political divisions. The American connection was equally extraordinary. Whitman had discovered that several of Harvard's founders had documented connections to European libraries and scholarly networks that matched the patterns Margaret had been studying. The funding sources and manuscript acquisitions suggested that Harvard had been established as part of a broader knowledge preservation effort. The founders weren't just establishing a college, Margaret realized. They were creating an American branch of a global knowledge network. Harvard was designed to be a preservation center from the beginning. Similar patterns existed at Yale, Princeton, and the College of William and Mary. The network had expanded across the Atlantic, ensuring that the Templars' accumulated knowledge would survive even if European civilization collapsed. Margaret spent weeks coordinating with her international colleagues, gradually piecing together the global scope of the Templar network. The evidence suggested that the network had not only survived into the modern era, but had actually become the foundation of the modern academic system. The documents demonstrated that the network had not only preserved individual texts, but also entire bodies of knowledge that would have otherwise vanished. The translation project had saved classical Greek and Roman texts, Islamic scholarship, and Byzantine learning from destruction. The network had maintained libraries and research centers that had operated independently of official institutions. The network achieved something unprecedented, Margaret told Morrison during one of their regular video conferences. It created a system that could transcend religious, political, and cultural divisions. The Templars established principles of scholarly collaboration that became the foundation of modern academic practice. The investigation had revealed that the network had played a crucial role in every major intellectual development in Western civilization. The Renaissance had been possible because the network had preserved classical texts. The network's tradition of international collaboration had facilitated the scientific revolution. The Enlightenment had built on philosophical texts that the network had maintained for centuries. Margaret realized that the network had been remarkably inclusive for a medieval institution. The documents showed evidence of collaboration between Christian, Islamic, and Jewish scholars, between men and women, and between people of different social classes. Regardless of its source or the identity of its creators, the network remained committed to preserving knowledge. Margaret returned to Paris in February with a profound understanding of what she had discovered. The investigation that had begun with a water-damaged manuscript had revealed the existence of a knowledge preservation network that had operated for over 7 centuries and had fundamentally shaped the intellectual development of human civilization. Back in her office at the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, Margaret spread out copies of all the documents she had studied. The manuscripts from Paris, Scotland, Venice, Prague, Istanbul, and Boston formed a comprehensive picture of the Templars' true legacy. The Templars' treasure was never about gold or silver, Margaret told Morrison, who had flown from Edinburgh to hear her conclusions. It was about creating a system that could preserve and transmit human knowledge across centuries and civilizations. The evidence was overwhelming. The network had operated continuously from the 12th century to the present day, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core mission of knowledge preservation. The preservation centres had evolved from medieval monasteries to Renaissance libraries to modern research universities. Margaret had identified patterns that suggested the network was still operating in the 21st century. Modern academic institutions, research foundations, and scholarly networks showed the same characteristics that had defined the Templars' original system. The network had not disappeared. It had become so successful that it was now embedded in the fundamental structure of contemporary scholarship. The documents revealed that the network had preserved entire bodies of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. The network had maintained libraries and research centres that had operated independently of official institutions, ensuring that knowledge would survive even when governments and religious authorities tried to suppress it. The network's greatest achievement was its adaptability, Margaret realised. It survived the Crusades, the Black Death, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and 2 world wars. It adapted to each new challenge while maintaining its core mission. The evidence suggested that the network had played a crucial role in every major intellectual development in Western civilization. The network had been committed to preserving knowledge regardless of its source, creating a system that could serve all of humanity. Margaret spent the rest of February preparing her findings for publication. The research would require years of additional investigation to fully document, but the basic outlines were clear. The Knights Templar had created the most successful knowledge preservation system in human history. The true treasure of the Knights Templar was not gold or silver, but the intellectual infrastructure of modern civilization. They had preserved and transmitted the knowledge that had made the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment possible. Their greatest achievement was not the accumulation of wealth, but the creation of a system that could serve humanity's eternal quest for knowledge and understanding. As Margaret looked out her office window at the city of Paris, she realised that she was surrounded by evidence of the Templars' legacy. The libraries, universities, and research institutions that filled the city were all part of the network that the medieval knights had established. The treasure had never been hidden. It had been hiding in plain sight, embedded in the foundations of human knowledge itself. The investigation was complete, but Margaret knew that the network's work would continue. The principles that the Templars had established, the free exchange of ideas, international collaboration, and the preservation of knowledge for future generations, would guide humanity's intellectual development for centuries to come. The treasure of the Knights Templar was not a historical artifact, but a living system that would continue to serve humanity's eternal quest for truth and understanding. Harold Weatherby had been tracking storm patterns for the National Weather Service for 37 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the archived barometric readings from November 24, 1971. The data should have been routine: pressure measurements, wind velocity, precipitation levels. But buried within the meteorological records was an anomaly that made his coffee grow cold as he stared at his computer screen. The wind patterns that Thanksgiving Eve told a story that contradicted everything the FBI had concluded about the Cooper case. According to Harold's calculations, the downdrafts and crosswinds between Portland and Seattle would have made it impossible for anyone to land where the Bureau claimed Cooper had jumped. The man who called himself Dan Cooper hadn't vanished into the wilderness as everyone believed. He had landed in a completely different location. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he cross-referenced the atmospheric conditions with topographical maps. The convergence of wind patterns created a natural funnel effect that would have carried a parachutist southeast, not southwest. This meant Cooper had landed in a completely different county, possibly even a different state. For over 50 years, search efforts, speculation, and countless theories had concentrated on the wrong geographic area. The revelation struck Harold with the force of a lightning bolt. He had stumbled upon evidence that could rewrite history. But as he reached for his phone to call the FBI, something made him pause. The timestamp on the meteorological data showed it had been accessed multiple times over the decades, always by the same government identification number. Someone else knew about the wind patterns. Someone had been actively suppressing this information. Harold's heart pounded as he realized the implications. The Cooper case wasn't just unsolved, it was deliberately kept that way. The mystery that had captivated America for generations was a carefully constructed facade. But why? What was so important about maintaining the illusion that Cooper had disappeared into the Washington wilderness? As he investigated the archived files, Harold discovered a pattern of data manipulation that extended far beyond simple meteorological readings. Flight manifests had been altered, witness testimonies had been redacted, and physical evidence had been systematically reclassified. The Cooper case was not merely a mishandled robbery, but rather a massive cover-up. The realization that he was now privy to dangerous information settled over Harold like a shroud. His discovery had the potential to reveal a conspiracy spanning across the highest echelons of government, but it also positioned him as a potential target. The same forces that had kept Cooper's true fate hidden for half a century wouldn't hesitate to silence an elderly meteorologist who had stumbled upon their secret. Harold's mind raced as he considered his options. He could pretend he had never seen the data, delete his research and return to his quiet retirement. Or he could follow the evidence wherever it led, knowing that the truth about D.B. Cooper might cost him everything. The weight of 5 decades of deception pressed down on him as he made his choice. He began copying the files to an encrypted drive, his movements quick and efficient despite his age. If something happened to him, at least the evidence would survive. The truth about Cooper's sky heist wasn't just about a man who jumped from a plane. It was about a conspiracy that had shaped American history in ways no one could imagine. As Harold worked through the night, digitizing decades of suppressed evidence, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The same instinct that had kept him alive through tornado seasons and hurricane tracking now screamed warnings about the storm he was about to unleash. The Cooper case was about to be blown wide open, and Harold Weatherby was standing at the epicenter of a revelation that would shake the foundations of everything America thought it knew about that fateful Thanksgiving Eve in 1971. Margaret Chen had been working as a senior analyst at the Department of Justice for 23 years when the encrypted file arrived in her secure inbox. The sender was identified only as barometric truth, but the meteorological data contained within shattered everything she thought she knew about the Cooper investigation. As she studied Harold Weatherby's research, Margaret realized she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the federal government. The implications were staggering. When Margaret compared Harold's wind pattern analysis with the government's internal reports, she discovered a clear deception. The FBI hadn't simply failed to solve the case. They had actively worked to ensure it remained unsolved. The question that haunted Margaret was why. Her security clearance granted her access to Operation Northwood's documents, Project Blue Book files, and other classified materials that most Americans would never see. But the Cooper files were different. They were compartmentalized beyond normal classification levels, restricted to a select group of officials who had maintained their silence for over 5 decades. Margaret's attempts to access the complete files triggered automatic alerts that would certainly draw unwanted attention. Working carefully within the system, Margaret began to piece together the true scope of the Cooper cover-up. The hijacking hadn't been a random act of desperation or a well-planned robbery. It had been a carefully orchestrated operation designed to conceal something far more significant. The man who called himself Dan Cooper was no ordinary skyjacker. He was a government operative whose mission had gone catastrophically wrong. The deeper Margaret dug, the more she realized that Cooper's jump from Flight 305 had been an extraction, not an escape. The parachutes, the money, and the meticulous planning all indicated a professional operation with government backing. But something had gone wrong during the extraction, something that required the creation of an elaborate mythology to explain Cooper's disappearance. Margaret's investigation unearthed a series of personnel files sealed since 1971. The files held the records of deep cover operatives engaged in classified projects during the Cold War. One name stood out: Daniel B. Cooper, a CIA operative who had been declared killed in action 3 days before the hijacking. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The revelation that Cooper, a government agent, had supposedly died before the hijacking suggested a level of deception that left Margaret feeling uneasy. The entire Cooper mythology had been constructed to hide the fact that a CIA operative had gone rogue and disappeared with classified information that could have compromised national security. The money from the hijacking was never the real prize. It It was the intelligence Cooper had stolen that made him so dangerous. Margaret's hands shook as she realized the full scope of what she had uncovered. The Cooper case wasn't just about a man who jumped from a plane. It was about a rogue operative who had potentially sold state secrets to foreign governments. The cover-up had been necessary to prevent a scandal that could have brought down the CIA and exposed decades of illegal domestic operations. As she compiled her findings, Margaret became aware that her investigation had not gone unnoticed. Her computer access logs showed unusual activity, and she had the distinct feeling that she was being watched. The same security apparatus that had kept the Cooper secret for 50 years was now focused on her. She was playing a dangerous game against opponents who had perfected the art of making problems disappear. The weight of her discovery pressed down on Margaret as she realized that she held the key to one of America's greatest mysteries. But she also understood that revealing the truth could destroy her career, her life, and possibly her existence. The forces that had maintained the Cooper cover-up for half a century wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose their carefully constructed lie. Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would follow the evidence wherever it led, knowing that the truth about D.B. Cooper was worth the risk. The American people deserved to know that their government had been lying to them for 50 years, and Margaret Chen was prepared to pay the price for bringing that truth to light. Dr. Elena Vasquez had built her reputation on precision. As a theoretical physicist specializing in ballistics and trajectory analysis, she had consulted on everything from missile defense systems to accident reconstruction. When Harold Weatherby's meteorological data reached her through encrypted channels, Elena immediately recognized the significance of what she was seeing. The wind patterns told a story that contradicted 50 years of accepted wisdom about the Cooper case. Elena's laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology became the unlikely center of a historical investigation that would challenge everything America believed about its most famous mystery. Using advanced computational models and atmospheric simulation software, she began to reconstruct the exact conditions that Dan Cooper would have encountered during his jump from Flight 305. The calculations were complex, requiring Eleanor to factor in variables that the original FBI investigation had either ignored or misunderstood. Air density, thermal layers, wind shear, and gravitational effects all played crucial roles in determining where Cooper would have landed. But as Elena's simulations ran through thousands of iterations, one conclusion became inescapable. Cooper had not landed in the Washington wilderness, where the search had been concentrated. The trajectory analysis revealed that Cooper's landing zone was actually in northeastern Oregon, approximately 60 miles from where the FBI had focused their investigation. This wasn't a minor miscalculation. It was a fundamental error that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate misdirection. Eleanor's scientific training told her that such a massive oversight was unlikely to be accidental. Working with Margaret Chen's classified intelligence and Harold's meteorological data, Elena began to construct a three-dimensional model of Cooper's entire flight path. The simulation showed that Cooper had executed a controlled descent that demonstrated advanced parachuting skills. This wasn't a desperate leap into the unknown. It was a precisely calculated maneuver performed by someone with extensive training in high-altitude jumps. Elena's analysis of the physical evidence yielded even more disturbing conclusions. The money that had been found along the Columbia River showed signs of exposure patterns that were inconsistent with the official story. Chemical analysis revealed traces of compounds that suggested the bills had been buried deliberately, not scattered by natural forces. Someone had planted the evidence to support the narrative that Cooper had perished in the wilderness. The parachute fragments that had been recovered over the years told a similar story. Elena's examination of the fabric degradation patterns showed that the parachutes had been cut and weathered artificially to simulate decades of exposure. The evidence that had been used to support Cooper's death was as fabricated as the mythology surrounding his disappearance. As Elena's investigation progressed, she became aware of the personal risks she was taking. Her laboratory's computer systems had been infiltrated multiple times, and she had noticed unmarked vehicles parked outside her apartment. The same forces that had suppressed the truth about Cooper for 50 years were now focused on her, and Eleanor knew that her scientific curiosity had made her a target. The breakthrough came when Elena realized that Cooper's jump coordinates had been deliberately falsified in the official reports. The flight crew's statements about the exact location of the jump had been altered after the fact, shifting the apparent landing zone by dozens of miles. This level of deception could only have been orchestrated by someone with access to the highest levels of the investigation. Elena's computer models painted a picture of a precisely executed escape that bore no resemblance to the desperate gamble portrayed in popular culture. Cooper had jumped precisely when the conditions were ideal, fully aware of the atmospheric factors that would determine his landing site. He had landed safely in a predetermined location where extraction was possible. The scientific planning and successful execution of Cooper's escape completely transformed the case. The tale wasn't a story of a man who had vanished into the wilderness. It was the account of a professional operation that had been covered up by the very agencies tasked with solving it. Elena's calculations had revealed the truth that had been hidden for half a century. D.B. Cooper had survived his jump and disappeared into a new life, protected by the same government that claimed to be searching for him. Thomas Hartwell had spent 31 years in the basement archives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a ghost among the filing cabinets and storage boxes that contained the secrets of American law enforcement. His domain was a labyrinth of classified documents, cold case files, and evidence that would never see the light of day. When he received the encrypted package containing Harold Weatherby's meteorological analysis, Margaret Chen's classified intelligence, and Elena Vasquez's trajectory calculations, Thomas realized that his unique position made him the perfect person to uncover the complete truth about the Cooper case. The FBI archives contained more than just official reports and evidence logs. Hidden within the vast collection were personal memos, interdepartmental communications, and administrative records that painted a picture of the Cooper investigation that had never been revealed to the public. Thomas's systematic approach to document analysis had made him invaluable to the Bureau, but it also gave him access to information that could expose the most significant cover-up in FBI history. Thomas began his investigation by examining the personnel files of every agent who had worked on the Cooper case. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about the Bureau's commitment to justice. The lead investigators had been transferred or retired immediately after the case was officially suspended, and their personal files contained discrepancies that suggested they had been silenced rather than reassigned. The evidence logs revealed an even more disturbing pattern. Critical pieces of physical evidence had been mysteriously lost or destroyed over the years, always during periods when new investigators were assigned to the case. The timing of these losses suggested that someone within the Bureau was actively working to prevent the case from being solved. Thomas's analysis showed that the Cooper investigation had been sabotaged from within. Administrative records from 1971 contained references to Operation Maple, a classified program that Thomas had never encountered in his decades of archival work. The program had been initiated 3 days before the Cooper hijacking and terminated 2 weeks after Cooper's jump. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Thomas's attempts to access the complete Operation Maple files triggered security alerts that indicated the program was still classified at the highest levels. Thomas's investigation led him to a series of financial records that had been buried in the archives for 50 years. The records showed that significant amounts of money had been moved through covert accounts immediately after the Cooper hijacking, amounts that far exceeded the $200,000 Cooper had demanded from the airline. The financial trail suggested that the hijacking had been a cover for a much larger operation involving millions of dollars in untraceable funds. The personnel files revealed that Daniel B. Cooper had indeed been a CIA operative, but his official record had been sanitized to remove any reference to his specialized training in high-altitude operations and psychological warfare. The man who had walked onto Flight 305 was not a desperate criminal, but a highly trained professional with decades of experience in covert operations. Sarah Mitchell had built her career on asking uncomfortable questions. As an investigative journalist for the Washington Herald, she had exposed corruption in Congress, revealed defense contractor fraud, and uncovered scandals that had brought down cabinet officials. But nothing in her 20-year career had prepared her for the story that landed in her encrypted inbox on a cold February morning. The package contained Harold Weatherby's meteorological analysis, Margaret Chen's classified intelligence, Elena Vasquez's trajectory calculations, and Thomas Hartwell's archival discoveries, a comprehensive dossier that revealed the truth about the D.B. Cooper case. Sarah's initial reaction was skepticism. The Cooper case had been investigated by countless reporters, authors, and amateur sleuths over the decades, and the idea that a meteorologist, a government analyst, a physicist, and an archivist had uncovered evidence that had eluded the FBI for 50 years seemed improbable. But as she examined the documentation, Sarah realized that she was looking at the most significant story of her career. The evidence was overwhelming and mutually corroborating. Harold's wind pattern analysis proved that Cooper had landed in Oregon, not Washington. Margaret's classified files revealed that Cooper had been a CIA operative. Eleanor's trajectory calculations showed that the escape had been scientifically planned and executed. Thomas's archival research exposed the cover-up that had maintained the Cooper mythology for half a century. Sarah's investigation into the story's sources convinced her that the four individuals had acted independently, each following their own path to the same shocking conclusion. The convergence of their evidence created a narrative that was both compelling and terrifying. The Cooper case wasn't just unsolved, it was a carefully constructed lie that had been maintained by the highest levels of government. As Sarah began to verify the evidence, she encountered resistance that confirmed the story's significance. Government officials who had previously been accessible refused to return her calls. Sources within the intelligence community warned her that pursuing the story would end her career. The message was clear. The Cooper case was off limits, and Sarah's investigation had attracted attention from forces that operated outside normal channels. The deeper Sarah dug, the more she understood why the Cooper case had been kept secret for so long. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative would expose a CIA program that had conducted illegal domestic operations during the Cold War. The cover-up had been necessary to prevent a scandal that could have brought down the intelligence community and exposed decades of constitutional violations. Stonewalling and outright hostility met Sarah's attempts to corroborate the story through official channels. The FBI refused to comment on the meteorological evidence, the CIA denied any knowledge of Daniel B. Cooper, and the Department of Justice claimed that all relevant files had been destroyed. The wall of silence that surrounded the Cooper case was itself evidence of the conspiracy that Sarah was trying to expose. The personal cost of pursuing the story began to mount as Sarah's investigation continued. Her apartment was burglarized, her computer was hacked, and she received anonymous warnings about the consequences of publishing the Cooper revelations. The same forces that had kept the secret for 50 years were now focused on preventing her from revealing the truth to the American people. Sarah's editor at the Washington Herald initially supported her investigation, but as the evidence mounted and the pressure increased, he began to express concerns about the story's potential impact on the newspaper's relationship with government sources. The Herald's publisher, a man who had built his career on maintaining cordial relationships with Washington's power brokers, made it clear that the Cooper story would not be published. Faced with institutional resistance and personal threats, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would publish the Cooper revelations independently, using her own resources and accepting the consequences of exposing one of the most significant cover-ups in American history. The same forces that had concealed the truth about D.B. Cooper for half a century could not afford to bury it. Sarah's investigation had revealed that the Cooper case was more than just a mystery. It was a window into the shadow government that operated beyond public scrutiny and constitutional oversight. The story began with the man who had jumped from Flight 305, unveiling the murky depths of American intelligence operations and the extreme measures the government took to safeguard its secrets. As Sarah prepared to publish her findings, she understood that she was about to become the most dangerous journalist in America. The Cooper revelations would reveal a conspiracy that penetrated the highest echelons of government, and Sarah Mitchell was ready to bear the consequences for revealing this truth. The truth about D.B. Cooper was more extraordinary than any fiction about him. Daniel Benjamin Cooper had been a CIA operative specializing in deep cover operations during the height of the Cold War. His mission on November 24, 1971, had been to intercept a Soviet agent who was planning to defect with intelligence about American defense systems. The hijacking had been a cover story, designed to explain Cooper's presence on Flight 305 and provide justification for his subsequent disappearance. Operation Maple had been a joint CIA-FBI program designed to conduct domestic surveillance operations against suspected communist sympathizers. Cooper's role had been to infiltrate Soviet intelligence networks and gather information about enemy operations on American soil. The program had been illegal under federal law, but it had been authorized at the highest levels of government and had operated in complete secrecy for over a decade. The Soviet agent Cooper, who was supposed to intercept, never made it to the rendezvous. Intelligence sources later revealed that the KGB had eliminated the defector before he could reach American soil. Cooper's mission had been compromised, but he had already begun the hijacking that was supposed to provide his cover story. With no defector to apprehend and no intelligence to gather, Cooper had been faced with a choice: abort the mission and risk exposure, or complete the operation and disappear into a new identity. Cooper had chosen to disappear, but his escape had been aided by the same government that officially claimed to be searching for him. The CIA had provided Cooper with the parachutes, the money, and the extraction plan that had allowed him to vanish without a trace. The subsequent search efforts had been theatre, designed to maintain the illusion that Cooper was a common criminal who had perished in the wilderness. The money that Cooper had demanded from Northwest Orient had been a fraction of the funds involved in Operation Maple. The $200,000 hijacking had been used to conceal the movement of millions of dollars in covert funding that had been allocated to illegal domestic surveillance operations. The Cooper case had provided the perfect cover for financial transactions that would have been impossible to justify through normal channels. Cooper's successful escape had created a problem for the intelligence community. A trained operative with knowledge of illegal domestic operations was now living under an assumed identity, potentially vulnerable to foreign recruitment or personal blackmail. They made the decision to uphold the Cooper mythology and prevent the public from learning the truth about his escape. Over the years, they carefully planted the physical evidence to support the narrative that Cooper had died during his jump. The money found along the Columbia River had been aged artificially and placed where it would be found by investigators. The parachute fragments had been cut and weathered to simulate decades of exposure. Every piece of evidence had been fabricated to support the official story. Cooper himself had been relocated to a secure facility where he had been debriefed and prepared for life under a new identity. The man who had jumped from Flight 305 had been given a new name, a new background, and a new life in exchange for his silence about Operation Maple and his knowledge of illegal CIA activities. He had been hidden in plain sight, protected by the same government that claimed to be searching for him. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative explained why the case had remained unsolved for over 50 years. The FBI hadn't failed to catch Cooper. They had succeeded in protecting him. The investigation had been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maintain public interest, while ensuring that the truth never emerged. The Cooper case had become a cultural phenomenon precisely because it had been designed to capture public imagination. The mysterious gentleman bandit who had outsmarted the system and disappeared into legend had been a creation of government propaganda, a story that had been carefully crafted to distract attention from the real crimes that had been committed under the cover of national security. The four individuals who had uncovered the truth about Cooper had been working independently, each following their path to the same shocking conclusion. Their evidence had converged to reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and exposed the dark reality of American intelligence operations during the Cold War. The Cooper case had been more than just a cover-up. It had been a test of the government's ability to control public perception and maintain official narratives in the face of contradictory evidence. The success of the Cooper mythology had provided a template for future deceptions, proving that even the most improbable stories could be accepted as truth if they were presented with sufficient authority and maintained with unwavering consistency. The disclosure of D.B. Cooper's true identity shook the American intelligence community and fundamentally altered the framework of government accountability. Sarah Mitchell's independent publication of the Cooper files triggered a cascade of events that exposed not just the truth about one famous skyjacker, but an entire network of illegal operations that had been conducted under the cover of national security. government officials launched a coordinated campaign to discredit the evidence and silence the whistleblowers who revealed the truth within hours of the story's publication. Harold Weatherby was arrested on charges of stealing classified meteorological data. Margaret Chen was suspended from her position at the Department of Justice. Elena Vasquez faced an investigation into her laboratory's security protocols, and Thomas Hartwell was terminated from his position at the FBI archives. The Cooper revelations exposed the government's extreme measures to safeguard its secrets. The four individuals who had uncovered the truth found themselves facing criminal charges, professional ruin, and personal threats. The same forces that had upheld the Cooper cover-up for half a century now targeted anyone who dared to reveal the wider conspiracy. Sarah Mitchell's publication of the Cooper files had been timed to coincide with the release of documents to multiple international news organizations, ensuring that the story could not be suppressed through normal channels. The evidence was simultaneously published in London, Berlin, and Tokyo, creating a global media sensation that forced American officials to respond to questions they had hoped would never be asked. The Cooper case garnered international attention, revealing the extent to which American intelligence operations transcended constitutional boundaries during the Cold War. The exposure of Operation Maple led to investigations into other domestic surveillance programs that had been conducted without congressional oversight or judicial authorization. The Cooper case unlocked decades of hidden government activities. Congressional hearings into the Cooper cover-up revealed that the conspiracy had been maintained by a small group of officials who had remained in positions of power for decades. These individuals had used their influence to ensure that the truth about Cooper never emerged, manipulating investigations, suppressing evidence, and eliminating anyone who came too close to the truth. The revelation that Cooper had been living under government protection for over 50 years raised questions about how many other mysteries had been deliberately maintained to conceal illegal activities. The Cooper case had been just one example of the government's willingness to deceive the public to protect its operational secrets and political interests. The search for Cooper himself became a global manhunt as intelligence agencies around the world attempted to locate the man who had become the most famous skyjacker in history. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative made him a valuable target for foreign intelligence services, and his knowledge of Cold War operations made him a security risk that could not be ignored. Cooper was eventually located living under an assumed identity in a small town in Montana, where he had been working as a high school physics teacher for over 4 decades. His peaceful existence had been shattered by the revelation of his true identity, and he found himself at the center of a media circus that threatened to expose not just his past, but the lives of everyone he had come to know and love. In exchange for immunity from prosecution and protection for his family, the man once known as D.B. Cooper agreed to testify before Congress. His testimony unveiled the complete scope of Operation Maple and exposed the illicit activities carried out under the guise of national security. His words brought down a government based on lies and deception. The Cooper revelations triggered a constitutional crisis that forced America to confront the reality of its shadow government and the extent to which democratic institutions had been subverted by intelligence operations. The case that had begun as a simple hijacking had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and challenged the very foundations of American democracy. The 4 individuals who had uncovered the truth about Cooper became symbols of the power of independent investigation and the importance of government accountability. Their bravery in exposing the conspiracy cost them their jobs and safety, but it also revealed the truth about one of America's most enduring mysteries and forced the nation to confront the reality of its hidden history. The solution to the Cooper case revealed a truth more disturbing than any mystery. The man who jumped from Flight 305 was a government agent, and the agencies that claimed to be looking for him helped him escape. The greatest mystery in American criminal history had been solved, but the truth had shattered the illusions that had sustained the nation for over 50 years. D.B. Cooper was never the gentleman bandit portrayed in popular imagination. He had been a weapon of the state, a tool of oppression disguised as a folk hero. The revelation of his true identity had exposed the dark reality of American power and the lengths to which the government would go to protect its secrets. The Cooper case was finally closed, but the reckoning had just begun.